All right, I want to give you a few things to look for in the seventh chapter of the meaning of Jesus' two visions. Just remember that this is written by N.T. Wright, and so you need to kind of take a step back and remember Wright's argument thus far, related especially to the mission and the message of Jesus. Remember that for N.T. Wright, Jesus really only makes sense as the Messiah who was announcing and inaugurating the kingdom of God. And so this chapter is really important for a few reasons. This is just a small portion of a lot of N.T. Wright's work. He's done a lot with the idea of resurrection, yeah, and it's really helped me out kind of think through some of these really difficult themes. So on the first few pages of the chapter, the question is like, what did the ancient people believe about death and about death, and maybe even later about resurrection? Yeah, so let me walk through a few things. On page 112 and 113, be sure you can differentiate between what a group of Jews called the Sadducees believed. So they really didn't believe in any sort of life after death. So on the top part of page 112. And then compare that to the Pharisees. That the Pharisees, on the bottom of page 112, they believed in this idea of like a bodily resurrection. Now they thought it was going to be that all of God's people were going to be raised from the dead at some point in time. And what they didn't believe, so I say down here, what they did not believe is that when you die, your soul floats off to heaven. That's a Greek idea. It's not a Jewish one. What the ancient Jews believed here is they didn't believe in a life after death. They really just believed that when you died, you were dead. You went to a place called Sheol, and Sheol is not a good thing. It's not a bad thing. It's just where dead people go. Just like it really translates as the grave. So yeah, my loved ones who I've been at their funerals, they are now they are in the grave. But as we move towards the first century, this idea of resurrection started to emerge about 200 years before Jesus. And he has this phrase in here that says, what began as a metaphor. So this idea that resurrection was a metaphor really became a concrete reality. And so really pay attention on those first 5 pages or so, especially on page 114. For like kind of 2 full paragraphs there, especially the one that starts, we should remind ourselves further that this whole idea of resurrection was this theology of hope. That when you died, yes, you were dead, but God is doing more than you and I often sort of think. That God is in the process of bringing about God's kingdom here on earth. And so really pay attention, page 114, 115. So in typical N.T. Wright fashion, on the bottom of 115, he asks this great question. What then did the earliest Christians mean when they said that Jesus of Nazareth had been raised from the dead? And so he's already told you the question he's going to address. And then on page 116, he tells you what they did not mean. So they did not mean that it was a spiritual resurrection, like Marcus Borg argues. They did not mean that you and I just have like personal experiences of Jesus. They did not mean that like kind of this new age had just like totally emerged. But really pay attention to page 17. So the paragraph that begins, so why did the early Christians use the term resurrection to describe what they believed happened to Jesus? Those 2 paragraphs are really quintessential, especially the bottom of that next paragraph, that if Jesus really was resurrected, if God really did raise from the dead, that means that, again, go back to N.T. Wright's last chapter, that the kingdom of God is here. That yes, as he says on the bottom of that paragraph, that the current age was still continuing, but the age to come had already been inaugurated. And then on page 118, again, the idea of resurrection was an idea of hope. And remember, the goal for Christianity, for N.T. Wright, is not to have your soul like float off to heaven, but it's to participate in God's salvific kingdom here on earth. And so the section on the evidence, so page 119, put your book down and read 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It's really going to help you understand those 2 pages when he talks about the evidence that Paul gives, because the Apostle Paul, one of the earliest thinkers of Christianity, he is doing some pretty tough kind of theology in 1 Corinthians. So be sure you read that. And in the Gospels, remember that the goals of the Gospels are not to simply provide historical accounts, and they're really there to provide meaning and perspective. And if you and I were to see some sort of a car accident or some sort of like fantastic event, we would all have different accounts of it. And his argument is that that is precisely what the Gospels are. They are very unedited. So another way to think of this is all four of the Gospels, they talk about the resurrection, but all four of them talk about it differently. So why is that? Well, if you're ever going to lie to somebody with a group of friends, don't you get your story together straight? You get your story straight before you tell somebody that lie? So Wright's argument is that because the texts, all four of the Gospels, tell the story differently, that means that they weren't in collusion with each other, that they were really telling a historically factual event, that God really did raise Jesus from the dead. And so that leads us to the final two sections. The historical conclusion, of course, is for N.T. Wright that God raised Jesus from the dead. But what does that mean? Really pay attention on 125, especially at the bottom when he says, rather, the meaning of the resurrection must begin with the validation of Jesus as the Messiah. But then, even more importantly, perhaps, on the top part of page 116, the cross was a victory, not a defeat. The idea that God raised Jesus from the dead has kind of the deepest meaning in the salvific redemption of the kingdom of God. That it is a kingdom here and now. It is a kingdom that is victorious over evil. And so really pay attention on page 126 and 127. So this is a really good chapter. It's a little bit tough, but take your time, and I think that you'll do just fine.